When Verdansk returns to Warzone in March 2025, it would have been 5 whole years since the release of Call of Duty Warzone. When Warzone released, half of the entire planet was sat indoors. A world where Call of Duty's version of Resurgence and Rebirth Island didn't even exist. With the 5th year of Call of Duty Warzone on the horizon, I decided to take a look back at just how much Warzone has changed in 4 years. That some of the stuff you're going to see in this video will genuinely surprise or shock you. We're talking about an era when Call of Duty didn't even have an anti-cheat. Warzone's anti-cheat only released in October 2021 under Call of Duty Vanguard. So I wanted to take a look back in time at all of the individual eras of Warzone and just how much has changed since then. And the first place to start is day 1, Verdansk 2020. This was the era where everything was brand new. The idea of the word meta didn't really even exist, and Warzone in just 24 hours amassed 6 million players. This was a number that would grow to 100 million downloads by the end of the year in just under 12 months. And the early days of Warzone were honestly just good fun. The idea of a game having a certain competitive edge to it basically didn't exist in Warzone. The idea of advanced movement didn't exist, the idea of various different types of metas and methodologies on how to win didn't exist. It was the early days of this game that were arguably some of the purest. And this was a period of time where Warzone actually invested in having a lot of fun with the game modes. We're talking about Zombie Royale and the Haunting event. We're talking about things like Juggernaut Royale. We're talking about things like shotguns and snipers. Towards the end era of Verdansk 2020, there were definitely some growing pains. Metas definitely did start to become more prevalent as people noticed weapons like the AMAX, and people did start to realize that Warzone was going to have an underlying problem by not having an anti-cheat. PlayStation players and Xbox players also suddenly realized that their brand new consoles wouldn't be capable of running Warzone any better because it wasn't developed for new generation consoles, leaving them stuck at 80 FOV in a very cross-play competitive environment, where their PC counterparts were playing with higher frame rates and higher field of views. After 6 very content-packed seasons in the first year of Warzone, we transitioned over to Warzone's Cold War era at the end of 2020, but this new Call of Duty didn't release with a new Royale. There were entire rumor mills that Blackout 2 had been developed by the developers over at Treyarch and very swiftly abandoned, and this created a number of rumors about new maps for Call of Duty Warzone that never really surfaced. It's safe to say that Blackout 2 was in full development and did intend to release with Black Ops Cold War, but with over 100 million people downloading Call of Duty Warzone, there was simply no way that they were going to abandon such a strong brand and a game that had effectively solidified itself amongst people like Fortnite and PUBG. The Black Ops Cold War era for Call of Duty Warzone is one of the most up and down eras for the entire franchise. Verdansk gets nuked off the rip in a one-of-a-kind event that takes Call of Duty Warzone effectively offline. And this was a really exciting moment for the vast majority of players who wanted to witness their first in-game Warzone event, and it was pretty well received, with thousands upon thousands of people watching online. But coming to the realization that they were playing another version of Verdansk that wasn't radically different from the one they'd already played, some people started to lose interest. So the Verdansk 84 era definitely had a bit of a rocky start. On top of Call of Duty not really planning for Warzone's long-term support, they also had to deal with the fact that Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War was based on an older version that was incompatible with Call of Duty Warzone, which meant that every character skin, every weapon skin, and every major change that happened in Black Ops Cold War had to be recreated and reinvented from scratch in the IWA engine. This meant that some character skins looked different and probably effectively doubled development time, and that wouldn't be the end of trouble for the Cold War era. The first was arguably the DMR meta, and it effectively meant that for the first time ever, Call of Duty fans were starting to focus on the things that were broken in the game, the metas that were broken, and how to potentially abuse them. The second major thing is that skill-based matchmaking started to become on the radar for even casual conversations within Warzone, and players felt that they were being a little bit confused or cheated by how the Call of Duty system worked.
There should not be SBMM, a skill-based matchmaking in casual. Period. End of story. That is literally the end of the discussion.
And the third biggest conversation, which definitely linked into the Call of Duty SBMM conversation, was that cheating started to become an epidemic on the main stage for Warzone, and was starting to get real visibility amongst content creators and professional players who explained that this game didn't have an anti-cheat. And once it was clear that Warzone didn't have an anti-cheat, it was effectively the Wild West until they did develop one at a later date. The only way that you could avoid cheaters during the Cold War and Verdansk eras of Warzone was literally to block them. Reporting them effectively led to nothing, and manual ban waves only got a small number of cheaters in comparison to the numbers that were used. But the Cold War era wasn't necessarily a complete failure, and in fact it had a lot of success too. Introduced arguably the biggest thing in Call of Duty's history for Warzone, which is Resurgence. The return of Rebirth Island was something that wasn't there from launch. Resurgence as a mode is so popular now that it arguably probably does dwarf the big map content ecosystem, and you can see that from the most recent year of Call of Duty Warzone. Casual players definitely lean towards the respawn modes, and it's safe to say that the introduction of something like Resurgence ended up completely reshaping the landscape not only for big map, but also in terms of the mechanics available to it. After player fatigue effectively took over during the Cold War era, the Vanguard era was definitely the least popular era of Warzone. The Caldera map itself had a very cold reception, with lots of open spaces, greenery that made visibility miserable, and generally something that was really hard for console players to enjoy, just down to the visuals alone. And despite Call of Duty Vanguard reintroducing the main multiplayer title to the IWA engine, and therefore making Warzone development easier, World War II weapons were generally quite unpopular, planes and bombers were unpopular, and the Caldera map I think is arguably remembered as the least popular big map appearance in all of Warzone. The Caldera era wasn't entirely terrible, and it did also mark the release of the anti-cheat for Call of Duty Warzone, which by the release in 2021 was desperately required. The one thing I definitely will always appreciate about the Vanguard era of Warzone is that in June 2022 it did give us the release of Fortune's Keep, which to this day, in my view, is still the best Resurgence map we've ever had, and still the best designed Resurgence map we've ever had. Generally speaking, Call of Duty Warzone plateaued. It didn't really have new content that brought people into the game, and it ultimately felt very stale and different from what people remembered and enjoyed from the earlier iterations of the game. So it's no surprise that in November 2022, the Modern Warfare 2 era began and Al Mazrah released. A map that, to this day, I don't think has been topped. I genuinely think Al Mazrah is the best map we've seen in Call of Duty Warzone for big map, and although the mechanics were fundamentally different, I would love to see it return to the franchise. But November 2022 was effectively the great reset for Call of Duty Warzone. The Modern Warfare 2 era completely changed how Warzone worked. We're talking about radical changes, no loadout drops to be seen for entire swathes and segments of the map. We're talking about looting systems that introduced backpacks that felt more like the DMZ extraction mode and less like a fast-paced battle royale. And we're talking about a game that just didn't really feel like Warzone. An era for Warzone that's so different from everything that came from before that floating loot disappeared. Interacting with a loot crate meant that you brought up a miniature menu. An era where effectively every single building in the entire map featured artificial intelligence that wanted to shoot you, and completely ruined the flow and gameplay of how Call of Duty worked. The introduction of things like black sites and strongholds that felt almost incompatible with the overall design of Warzone, and slower gameplay that just felt like we were playing Warzone with bricks on our feet.
I'm not going to stream Warzone for a little bit. I'm over that game, dude. Like I said, just the people who are making it, whatever their decisions they're making is just the complete opposite direction of the way the game should go.
By the summer the following year, Modern Warfare 2 had tried to undo a fair number of the changes it had already made because of the fact that it was losing players at an alarming rate. They also brought us Ashika Island in this era, which was also quite deeply unpopular, and generally speaking, Modern Warfare 2's version of Warzone, and arguably Infinity Ward's baby returning to them, was the least popular era Call of Duty has had so far. And this all leads to the Warzone that we have today. I mean, it really does go to show just how much has changed. Redeploy balloons didn't exist. Redeploy packs and flares didn't exist. Portable buy stations weren't a thing. There was a period of time where stopping power doubled the power of any gun and was completely broken. Gas mechanics didn't exist beyond a gas mask, there was no portable decontamination stations, there were no perks that interacted with the gas system. Airstrikes used to go through entire buildings and kill people even though they were inside a building. Perk packages completely were introduced into the game as lootable items that weren't previously lootable before. The looting system went from not having a backpack to having a backpack to having the backpack removed in Black Ops 6's era, which is upcoming. Floating loot has never made a return to Warzone, for reasons that I don't think anybody quite understands. Loadouts completely disappeared and then were reintroduced in the Modern Warfare 2 era, and for those of you who don't remember, when Al-Mazrah were released, there were AI in every single building. I'm not even kidding, this is something that people have completely forgotten about. There were AI in nearly every single building in Warzone. The eras of Warzone that I've completely described to you here are so different from one another, and it's going to change again in Black Ops 6 with the introduction of a new movement system that will fundamentally change how Warzone works again.